Good morning. My name is Joe Fish-Kay. I'm Principal Research Scientist at Mozilla, and it is my pleasure today to introduce you to Jeff Hancock. I just checked this morning. I've known Jeff for 17 years. I first met Jeff in 2003 at the Chi conference in Fort Lauderdale. At the time, I had finished a master's degree, and I was looking forward to becoming a PhD student somewhere. And hello. And Jeff was a huge part of that decision for me to go to Cornell. And I was actually lucky enough to have Jeff as a member of my committee. Today, Jeff is going to be talking about trust and well-being in this world of COVID-19. And I think that's particularly relevant and important to Mozilla. It's relevant to the whole world because of how our practices and how our everyday has changed, like having children walking through when you're giving introductions to people's talks. But also because trust is so important to Mozilla. Mozilla relies on trust. Our brand is about trust and our identity is about trust. And we run into the problems that we think it is very important that people trust us, and yet we don't always have a strong sense of what the competition looks like for that, right? I saw a poll about 6 months ago, and it said, would you trust this company with your medical data? And Amazon came in at something like 71%, Google came in at 68%, and Mozilla came in at 65%. And I thought that was fascinating because we believe that we are this bastion of truth, this bastion of trusted engagement. And the more we can understand that and understand how people make these decisions about what to trust and who to trust and when to trust, I think that's crucial for the company and really crucial for the survival of the internet, which is a medium that is really driven by trust from the very beginning. And that's why I'm quite so excited to have Jeff here. So I'm going to stop pontificating. You'll be seeing more from me later on. One thing I would like to encourage Mozillians, please join me on the speaker-series Slack channel, where I'll take questions. For folks outside the company, I will take questions at twitter.com/joefish, and I look forward to hearing from you. Over to you, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe Fish. Really appreciate it, and thank you for the invitation. I was telling Joe Fish earlier that this is my first talk in the COVID-19 era, so first time doing this virtually, and I'm lucky enough not to be teaching right now. Most of my colleagues are doing this kind of class every day. So bear with me if there's any issues. As Joe Fish said, today we're going to talk a lot about trust. I will kind of do a deep dive underneath the hood of what trust is. We're going to take a detour over into deception detection to try and learn a few things about trust and trustworthiness there. And then, because this is something that's been on, I think, everybody's mind now that we're using technology all the time to engage in distant socializing, I'm going to talk about well-being as well, which I actually think is an important and related construct to trust. And basically, we'll go over the largest meta-analysis that's been done to date, looking at how social media is related to well-being. And big question is, does using social media affect our well-being? And I can tell you, before the pandemic, almost all of the public narrative was that, yeah, it was really bad for us. And I think that's dramatically changing. We'll see whether that's consistent with what we're finding in our research. We'll have a point maybe halfway through where we'll do some polls, and Joe Fish will organize that. And also about halfway through, we can talk about any questions that people have about trust before we make that shift into well-being. So this question of how trust works and the way in which maybe trust is declining feels like an important question right now. It feels like trust is on the decline. It feels like there's less and less of it, that maybe prior generations were more trustworthy than ours. But this is not a new phenomenon. Actually, this is really old. It looks like every generation thinks that the previous generations were more honorable and more trustworthy and lied less. And it goes back to our very beginnings, really. Some of you out there that had some classical training may recognize this fellow. This is Diogenes, and he's holding up a lantern in which he was searching for a single honest man. And of course, the story goes he never found one and died without finding one. A really uplifting story for those of you looking for some light reading. So the Greeks were deeply concerned that people were becoming less honest, less trustworthy. And this wasn't just a Western society phenomena. Also in the East, Confucius, around the same time, was developing his sort of philosophy, and a core part of it was authenticity, being real, not only talking the talk but walking the walk, which is maybe the worst summary of what Confucianism is, but that's roughly the idea here. So we've had throughout human history deep concerns that trust is on the decline, that people are less good. I think that we are feeling that now, and we look about to cast blame, as is we want to do typically. And I think technology and the internet is attracting much of that. And as I'll argue throughout this, I think technology is definitely changing the way we trust, but I don't believe it's leading to necessarily a decline. Although whether there is a real decline or not is a real question. I'll show you some evidence that perhaps there is. My own personal take on trust professionally started about 25 years ago. This is 1996. I was a customs officer in Canada, working on the maritime border. So checking lots of boats and things like that. You can see that I have a little bulge there. You might think that's a weapon, a gun, but actually that's just a stamp welcoming you into Canada, because that's how we Canadians roll, a little bit more welcoming. But it was my very first experience of thinking about, okay, is this person lying to me? Like they might have a weapon, they might have more alcohol than they say, they might have drugs. And so it was my first time of trying to professionally think about this issue of trust. And trust is one of these strange things where it's sort of like freedom to move about and go to the office. It's not something that you miss until it's been taken away. It fits that really well. Trust is in many ways the glue that holds society together. It's what makes living possible. It allows the use of money, contracts, law, pretty much undergirds almost all of the major sort of functioning of human activity. And it's one of those things that's invisible until it's gone, and then we realize how much and how important it is. Because it's so big, it's also really ambiguous and difficult to define. When we ask people what they think of trust, these are kind of the topics that will come up, the ideas. It's related to risk and uncertainty, this idea that, like, I'm not sure that Joe Fish will be there when he says he's going to be there, so there's some risk. Or if I am buying something from him online, how do I know that when I send the money that the product will arrive? And when you look through the main large successful online companies, that was one of the main trust points that they had to solve, was how do you make it so that the money moves between partners. And so that was, from Alibaba to Airbnb to BlaBlaCar in Europe, a key advance for those companies was figuring out how payments worked. And it was because of this risk and uncertainty part. Another really important notion, and we're going to focus on this a lot today, is that trust is the keeping of promises and the understanding of one's expectations. And I think that's a really core sort of idea. And the last is reliability and confidence. Typically, these are more time related. So as we'll talk throughout the discussion today, there's really three things that can signal trust. One of them is reliability. Another is the competence, that somebody or something seems competent. And the other is that they come across as honest or trustworthy. And those are the three simple, cues to trustworthiness. Of course, hard to implement them, but we'll see those come up again and again throughout our discussion today. My favorite single definition of trust is this one from a German sociologist, Niklas Luhmann. Trust is the confidence in one's expectations. And here it's usually about what other humans will do. Will Joe Fish be there? Will he send me the thing that I bought from him? Will that girl I'm going to go meet after checking out her online dating profile look like that person. These are all about confidence in one's expectations. And it has this sort of promissory piece to it where when people say that they're going to be or do or look like something, that's a promise. And then the question is, to what degree can you trust that promise? And those are what set up your expectations. So let's start with a little bit of a history of trust over time. Trust appeared to sort of start in a dyadic way. So when it was very small groups of people, we would trust one another because of our relationship. So I would trust Joe Fish, and that would be based entirely on our relationship. As we got into larger groups of humans, we could no longer have a one-on-one trust relationship with everybody that we had in our social group. And so then there was the rise of distributed trust. So I might trust Joe Fish not because I know him, perhaps I don't, but my other friend, Amy, who knows Joe Fish, trusts Joe Fish. And since I trust Amy, then I can also trust Joe Fish. So the trust becomes embedded in my social network. And that's really powerful because now I can trust a whole lot more people. And those people are incentivized to act trustworthy, because if they don't, if they betray me in some way or deceive me, then they've also harmed their relationship with somebody else, not just with me, but the other people in my network that we share. So this is where reputational type trust comes in, and this was a development as we move into larger social groups. Then as we move into even larger, so beyond villages but into cities, it's no longer efficient really to rely just on distributed trust. Here we start to rely on institutions. So now, instead of having to trust that Joe Fish will do something, I can rely on the church, or I can rely on government or journalism to keep our trust in check. So if I were buying something from Joe Fish now and he scammed me, or he failed to pay, I could actually bring law in. I could bring the police in. These larger institutions. Earlier in our history, the church was perhaps the longest and most powerful institution. The last century was a very strong institutional trust century. Trust in government, trust in media, trust in church. All of these trust in corporations were very high. And as we'll see here in a minute, these are starting to decline. One reason for that is it's not like there's the dyadic form of trust, or there's only the distributed, or there's only the institutional. They're constantly working. I have a dyadic relationship with Joe Fish. We also share a social network, and we each have institutions that we engage with. So I'm at Stanford, and he's at Mozilla, and there's all these other ones that I've mentioned, like the law and police, etc. So they're constantly now interacting with one another. And we're seeing, in some ways, distributed trust having an influence on institutional trust. And here's my take on how that's going. I think that with distributed trust, we're seeing a rise, in a way, more and more emphasis on distributed trust, partly because of digitization over the last 20 to 30 years, everything moving digital. It's much more easy to share information, to move information around. The rise of social networking sites, the ability to share with large amounts of people, the sort of rise of social has made social trust, or trust in social networks, more powerful. And then big data and AI are changing the ways we can know things. So we have the ability to assess, millions of documents and summarize and analyze them. And we have new techniques for doing that. These phenomena that are sort of related to distributed trust and empowering distributed trust, I think, in leading to a decline in institutional trust. It's affecting the way institutions can operate. And this is leading to a lot of scandals. In fact, if you think back to any major scandals over the last 10 to 15 years, they tend to involve some form of these digitization, social, big data, and AI. An example are the Panama Papers. This was a leak of papers with millions of documents that were then analyzed by a group of journalists using, pretty advanced NLP and AI to then unmask the financial malfeasance of a number of politicians, world leaders, variety of rich people. And these kinds of scandals sort of show how the sausage is made in institutions, and that I don't think institutions necessarily are more corrupt or more deceptive than they were in the past, but the rise of network trust and all the tools associated with it is giving us some insight into how they've operated. So we're seeing more and more scandals about politicians, more and more scandals about banks, about the media. All of these large institutions we've relied on and trusted are becoming a little more transparent, not of their own accord, but because of all these new tools we have. So one possibility is it's not that they're becoming more deceptive or corrupt, but rather we're seeing more of what's going on, and in part because of all these tools. So we're seeing these changes and these shifts in the way that trust works. And I think thriving companies these days are adjusting to those. So if you think of a company, for example, like Airbnb, certainly before the pandemic, it was taking all of the networked trust dynamics by allowing people to see who would be renting their place or staying in their home. But they were embedding that sort of network trust inside the institutional trust. So Airbnb would say, you know what, don't worry, you have insurance. It's $1 million in insurance. So they're using this large institutional trust approach. They're also saying, if you run into trouble, we'll bring in the police, we'll bring in the law, we'll have our own safety and security people. Payments, they'd figured out payments. You'll never see money from another person. We'll take care of that for you. They're going to pay us and we'll pay you, and that's guaranteed. So I think a lot of companies that are thriving right now are adjusting by recognizing that network trust is really important, and then building that on top of these kind of legacy institution forms of trust. And I think that's going to be an important way forward as companies adjust to how technology is shifting these trust dynamics. Obviously, there was a huge shock to the sort of idea around trust and technology with fake news that became a huge topic after the 2016 election. And this led to the trust crisis. This is the cover of the Harvard Business Review last summer. This has been an ongoing sort of concern for the last 2 years. When I get requests by companies to give talks, it's almost always about trust, how trust is changing, how to recover trust when there's been a violation, and what is going on with trust for the future. Part of that, I think, really was driven by the change in fake news, and we're seeing that even today. So this week, my colleague, Joan Donovan, had a piece in Nature talking about how social media companies need to do more around misinformation, especially with the COVID-19 phenomenon. What we'll look at when we look into deception is that people tend to lie for a reason. And with the pandemic, it's provided a way for people that want to try and scam for either money, persuasion, prestige, trolling. It's given them an outlet. There's so much attention on COVID-19 that it's easy to implement these kind of scams. And indeed, these scammers and malinfo operators are coming out of the woodwork. We're seeing tech companies starting to take more serious steps. So this is from the New York Times this morning, where Facebook's not only working on trying to reduce the visibility of misinformation related to the coronavirus, but is now actually going to be reaching out to people and letting them know that they've come into contact with misinformation. I think a fascinating and potentially hopeful new approach that remains to be seen whether it's going to be useful or not, and whether people will believe what Facebook has to say about their encounters with these fake news, or more broadly, misinformation. As with any kind of phenomena that academics get involved in, it takes a little while, though, to get really good research on it. And I'll admit that in 2016, when the fake news crisis sort of hit, and it became clear that there was a lot, and that it was a real problem, I was just starting a sabbatical, and was sort of shook in my um, faith in myself. Anyways, here I was, a researcher on deception and trust and technology, and I did not see the fake news thing coming at all. And I wondered, what happened? How did I miss this? How did I not see this coming? And I spent a lot of my sabbatical doing some sort of soul searching, and also trying to understand what happened. And I think that there are a couple of key things that have now come out that have helped me understand what I missed. And I want to share a couple of those with you. The first is that we I think overestimated how broadly fake news happened. So this is a finding from a really important piece that came out in Science in 2019. Again, it takes 2 years or so to get really great science out there, typically for something as complex as fake news. And that is that there was a lot of fake news, but it was very focused. As it says here, 1% of individuals accounted for 80% of fake news exposures. So most people weren't exposed to any fake news at all. A very small number of people received most of the exposures. And I started to suspect this when I was asking students in my class. We would do these exercises where I'd ask them to go through whatever feed they were most often using, and to look for fake news. And in a class of 70 to 80 people, we would go back weeks and none could find anything that would even be close to fake news. So here we are, these are a bunch of 20-year-olds that just couldn't find any fake news. And that turns out to be an important piece of the puzzle. The other is the second part of this, which is that a very small 0.1% of people accounted for almost all of the sharing. So there was a small number of us that were sort of super sharers. They were the ones that shared almost all of the fake news, so that most people received not very little, if at all any, and that a very small fraction did any of the sharing. And it wasn't random who was sharing. So this is from another really excellent paper by Andy Guess and colleagues, Josh Tucker and NYU. Conservatives were much more likely to share fake news stories. And people that were over 65, in that graph on the right, they were much more likely to be to share fake news. They were 7 times more likely to share fake news than somebody that was in my class. Now, is this because conservatives are worse? No, 100% not. Is this because older people are, somehow dumber or less, more gullible? No, I don't think that's the case at all. In fact, these people were targeted. They were targeted with almost all of the fake news. Part of it was because Trump, as a conservative candidate, was very attention grabbing. And so when people were producing fake news, typically it was for financial gain. They were targeting conservatives. And for older people, there is a whole long-standing industry of elder fraud, multi-billion-dollar industry. The FBI has its own division focused on this. Older folks are targeted because they are some of the wealthiest generation currently alive. So they have a lot of resources. They're very civically engaged, so you can actually get them to do things and to believe things. And relative to these other generations, tend to be a little bit less tech savvy. So it's not that they're less intelligence, but they have less experience than other generations in using online technologies. So they're also just being targeted, and that's why they end up sharing fake news. So this was one piece of the puzzle of like how I screwed up so badly and missed this. Is I tend to focus on general population. I'm often interested in how people, interpersonal ways, trust and deceive each other. And this was a huge change in the way that they were targeting very specific parts of the population. And it also suggests that we need to provide a lot of support to these folks. So we have a whole new research program aimed at helping older people, older adults. and happy to talk about that if people are interested. The other piece of that puzzle that I realized is a lot of my work tends to focus on people that we know. So we can think of this as our social tie network. These are people that I either have a reputational tie with, so I know Joe Fish and we have a history, or it could be that girl I want to go dating. I don't have I don't know her yet, but I want to, so I anticipate some future interaction. I want her to be a social tie. It could be a client, so I don't have a relationship with this company or this other person yet, but I want to do business with them. So my reputation's involved, and that's what social ties really are about. They're these connections with reputations. And that's where most of my research had focused. And there is, of course, online, this whole other world that we'll call the zero tie network. These are people that have no relationship with me, no anticipated relationship with me, but they're really what social media and online technologies make possible. So that Russian spy, the Nigerian prince, as well as legitimate advertisers and people that want me to get out and vote, these people and organizations can actually access me now because of online technologies through a variety of ways, from advertising to just reaching out on Twitter. So one problem here that I realized in my work was for a lot of people, these two things have merged online. And especially for the older people that I was just mentioning, people over 65, in particular people that didn't have email as part of their job before they retired. For these folks, the online, the social tie network and the zero tie network overlap. And this could be in your Facebook news feed, it could be in your Twitter feed, it could be in your inbox, your email inbox. And because those things now are just sitting on top of each other, without a lot of experience, it's difficult for people to tease those two networks apart and to understand that, yeah, when Joe Fish emails me and has an important request or needs me to do something, I need to do that, or what he says actually matters. Whereas Starman 6642, what he does, what he says, what he wants should have zero impact on me, my actions, my emotions. But when they're sitting on top of each other, it's really difficult for people that are lower in experience to tease those apart. And so their emotions and their actions and even their thinking can be influenced by Starman 6642. And that, I think, is another major problem for fake news, and another reason why I missed that, because we can look at those two worlds separately, but online they're obviously both involved. Okay, that's sort of a take on trust over time. We're going to look now at what we can learn about trust from deception detection research. It's an old field now, about 60 to 70 years of work in psychology and communication. There's been over 300 studies done, so there's some real key findings here that I'm going to share with you now, sort of think of it as a primer on deception detection. And out of it, we can pull some really, really core things about trust. One thing in particular that I'll share that I think is the most important thing going forward. To do that, we're going to do our first little experiment. And so with Joe Fish's help, I'm going to ask all of you to fill out a poll. I'll explain it as you go into either Slack or on twitter.com/joefish to participate. These are two hotel reviews of the James Hotel in Chicago. One of them is real. We took from hotels.com, which is a verified review site. You have to pay and stay to review. And the other we purchased. So we buy a lot of fake reviews. We never post them online, but we'll get Turkers, for example, to look at the website, and we can ask them to write a fake review. In this case, we asked them to write a positive fake review. Now, what your job is to decide which of these reviews about the James Hotel is fake. Is A fake or B fake? And in the polls, you can indicate whether you think A is fake or B is fake. And I'll give you 20 to 30 seconds to read through the two and make your choice. And Joe Fish, let me know if there's anything other instructions.
It's all good. votes are flooding in. Flooding in is a strong way to put it. Let's do.
Now, before Joe Fish shares the results, one of the main findings in meta-analyses, where all of the studies on deception detection are put together, is that when you have a 50-50 chance, people perform basically at 50-50. When we've analyzed these 300 studies and there are thousands and thousands of trials, people on average perform at 54% under these circumstances. So let's see if Mozillians can beat 54%, if we can get that kind of fidelity.
Right, we're just giving a little bit of time. I just checked, and we just got up to the bit in our folks who are watching in Hubs. They just saw you like ask the question.
Okay.
We've got 15 votes so far on Slack, and we've got another 4 votes over on Twitter. Let's give it another, I don't know, couple of minutes, a couple of seconds, and we'll see. So, all right. We're at 7 votes on Twitter. All right, I'm going to give it 15 more seconds, and then I'm going to call it.
Okay.
And we're getting comments in this channel. People like, well, it's hard to say. Both of them seem plausible.
Good.
Which is a good sign, right? That means you invested your money of buying fake reviews well.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to call it. So we have 13 on Twitter. We have 7 votes. 6 of them think that review A is fake, and 1 of them thinks that review B is fake. On Slack, it's a lot closer. On Slack, 13 people think review A is fake, and 14 people think review B is fake. So,
right. So pretty much exactly 50.
Exactly 50-50. All right, back to you.
Great. Well, it's actually 19 for A and 21 for B, which will give us pretty much exactly 54%, because B is the fake one. So Mozillians have fit exactly what the meta-analysis finds, which is that when it's 50-50, we do terribly. We basically perform right at chance. And for those of you that were looking and trying to make decisions, this is actually a really important kind of decision, because we all use reviews to decide where we go, once we're able to go places again. And all of you would have different kinds of cues that you would rely on. In this case, we were able to use a computer algorithm to detect what Turkers do differently than real reviewers. Some of you may have noticed the overly positive adjectives. That is indeed a problem. Turkers tended to be overly positive. But they did other things too, like they failed to talk about the rooms. They didn't use spatial terms as much. They tended to talk about themselves and who they were with and what they were doing more. This is like a narrative mode, and liars often switch into storytelling. For those of you that thought perhaps it was spelling mistakes, no, those are just bad spellers that not seem to be related. But that's great. So that's one of the most important findings, and something to be really thoughtful about, is that when we don't have any other information, we can't interrogate anything, we can't look at other corresponding information, we do really poorly when it's 50-50. And in fact, you guys were perfectly on just slightly above chance, just like everybody else. Another really important thing is that we tend to think that there's cues that relate to it. So when we poll people around the world, there's the eyes, and whether the eyes will tell you they're shifty or not. In fact, there's sort of these 3 channels: verbal, what people say; nonverbal; and physiological. And this is going to be hard for you to believe. It took me years to come to grips with this, but in fact, there is no Pinocchio's nose. There is no single cue that will tell you when people are lying. And even here, with this lie detector, that's not actually detecting lies, it's measuring arousal, which is only assumed to be correlated with lying. And they're not even allowed in a court of law in the US. And it took me a long time to come to grips with this, the fact that there's no Pinocchio's nose, but I can I can confirm there is no cue that will tell you every time when people are lying. In contrast, we rely on what we call believability cues. So these we think are related to deception, but in fact, they're not. Now here we'll do another poll. This will be much easier, and I'm guessing that we'll perform, very high with consensus that almost everybody will agree on one of these. But if you go back to the poll, you can choose which one of these do you think is the most trustworthy. Do you think A is the person that's the most trustworthy, or is B the one that's most trustworthy? So Joe Fish, maybe we can throw it to the poll again for this. And A is A trustworthy, or is B trustworthy?
All right, we're starting to get things coming in. Let's just check. All right, we're getting things coming in. I think
rely on what we call believability. So these we think are related to deception, but in fact not.
Okay, that was me checking that Hubs is working, and it's come through. So by the raw numbers, we're seeing B is most trustworthy. When I combine both polls, we're seeing 20 votes for B and 4 votes for A. But we also have comments like, both look fake, I'm not sure I want to trust any. And the point that trust is contextual. I would trust security threat analysis more from A. I would trust an offer of help more from B. I reject the implied framing of universal trustworthiness. I don't trust your poll. I love my colleagues.
Fantastic. Well, great points. In fact, people universally will trust B. They consider B to be more trustworthy. And this has been psychological work. The point about trust being contextual is hugely important, and I love that. Absolutely right. But when you ask somebody, who would you trust, and you had to pick one of these two people, it's pretty much a universal finding across cultures that B is the one that appears more trustworthy. Now, the fascinating thing, which one of your colleagues pointed out, is that there is no human here. These are totally computer generated. And despite that, we can make inferences. And so, right, the 20 people agreed that B is more trustworthy, even though there is no real human here. And it's because of those signals in the face. Same thing operates with deception. When people act friendly and nice and smile and seem calm, their demeanor is relaxed, they seem more believable. And it has actually nothing to do, it's completely independent with deception. And so the real key point here is we tend to assess believability, not deception. And that's where trust comes in. Trust is basically this initial framing of, does this person seem trustworthy? But then, as I pointed out earlier, reliability and competence are the other two main ingredients of trust over time. So one is about appearing, these sort of believability cues. How does a company come across? How does a leader come across? These impressions matter. They drive how we then interact with that person or that entity later. But over time, what matters is competence. Can they do what they say they do? And reliability. Do they do it when they say they're going to do it? And those are the three key ingredients of trustworthiness. The other things that we can learn here is, and these are the points that I've made, so we tend to perform a chance, there's no reliable cue, and we rely on believability. The last thing is the most important and only finding that replicates in every single deception detection study. The only replicated finding is something called the truth bias. That is that we believe other people automatically when we first hear them. It's not because we're nice, it's because of the way we designed language. We evolved language so that we have to have what we believe are cooperative partners. So our default is a trust state. And my favorite work right now, and a book I'd highly recommend for anybody interested in this further, is called Duped by Tim Levine. And in that, he lays out his theory called the trust default theory. So we begin any interaction with any human or entity in a trust state. And then we move out of that trust state only when we become suspicious, perhaps because there's something doesn't seem right. You've learned some other information from someone else. It contrasts with something you already know. And this truth bias is sort of the core of human trust. It's what allows it to operate. And as I mentioned, it's so powerful that it's the only finding we replicate in every single deception detection study until very recently. And so I want to share with you a study that we've done that to me is kind of worrisome. And I'm an optimist. I'm a Canadian and I'm an optimist, so it makes me feel pretty good about the future. And this study has me a little bit worried, and I'll explain why. The first thing I have to explain is when we have a truth bias, it leads to something called the veracity effect. And it turns out that 54% number is pretty much just a mathematical outcome of the truth bias. So if it's 50-50, like your hotel review, and I have a truth bias, most of the time I'm just going to say, yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's true. So when I'm shown truthful things, real messages or real reviews, I'm going to be really accurate. So I might, like on the right-hand side here, I might perform at 90% because I'm just saying true most of the time. And every once in a while, I'll say, oh, maybe that's fake and I'm wrong. But most of the time I'm saying true. And so just by chance, by saying true all the time, I'm going to be really accurate at truthful things. On the flip side, when I'm being lied to, I'm going to do really poorly. Because I'm going to keep saying true, 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 and I'll miss most of the lies. I might get the odd one, and so I'll have a little bit of accuracy. And that 54% number is actually the averaging of two different accuracies: truthful ability, my ability to detect true accuracies, which is high, and my ability to detect lies, which is low. Put them together, and they come down to this sort of 50% number. And so when you combine the truth bias with the underlying deception rate, you get this kind of effect. The veracity effect with the truth bias is I do really well with truth and I do really poorly with lies. This works in communication and information systems in which there's low rates of lying. Some rate depends on the system, but it should be relatively infrequent. When it's relatively infrequent and the truth bias is in place, I'll just be naturally accurate all the time. Most of the time, Joe Fish, when we talk, is telling me the truth. We've looked at text messaging, for example. College students and adults, text messages tend to be about 95 to 97% of the time honest. So that means when I see text messages from Joe Fish and I just do my truth bias, my accuracy is going to be really high. I'm going to perform at whatever his truthful rate is. I'll miss those 2 to 5%. Like when he says he's on his way, but in fact, he's just getting out of the shower. But in the overall system, it's working well. I don't have to think, do I trust him on this one? Do I trust him on this one? It's automatic. And that leads to this veracity effect, which is we're good with real, we're truthful, and we're bad with lying. The problem that comes out of the fake news phenomena is we're now really worried about the news and about media. And so we studies with my PhD student from Leo and former student David Markowitz, who's now at Oregon. We showed people headlines from Facebook, actual headlines, and they were either in politics, science, or health, and they were either real headlines or they were fake that we pulled from a fake news database. And we asked them to detect whether they thought it was. And here's how they performed. The three different domains, you can see health, politics, science. So we see there's these three kinds. How well they did, fake and real. So the dark bars are fake news. And you can see that they kind of did poorly. They were performing around 58%. People did pretty well in politics. One reason for that is they seem to be better versed in politics than in health and science news. And the detection accuracy was less than 60%. But in some cases, we could see they did better in fake news than in real news. You can see that with health and with politics. And so this is evidence of no truth bias, that in fact, there's a little bit here of a lie bias. And we don't get that veracity effect. We should see really good accuracy for real news and really poor accuracy for fake news. But in fact, people are really, really suspicious of any news now that they see, and obviously even more suspicious when they're in a experiment looking at this kind of thing. We read this study where we also included things like the likes were coming from friends, or there were lots of endorsements, like a lot of people shared it or a lot of people liked it. And we see the same kind of thing, that people are actually doing pretty well with the fake news, and roughly the same for real news. The point here is we don't see that veracity effect. Instead, what we see is a reduced ability to detect real news and an increased ability to detect fake news. On the surface, that might seem good, like, okay, good, we're going to get duped by fake news less often. But it's going to come at a huge cost. And to put it in perspective, all the concern in the media around fake news, and in part by academics like myself talking about fake news and the worries we have, is it's enhancing the public's ability to detect fake news. That's a good thing. The problem is most of the news that we encounter, even in social media, is real news. Fake news is a very small overall percentage. It's difficult to judge, and it varies by platform, but it's usually in the single digits of the amount of news that a person will consume in a day. So while we're improving our ability to detect fake news, that's a benefit that's relatively small compared to the hit we're taking on being able to understand what's real news, which is most of our news consumption. And that's a major worry that I have. All right, I think I'm going to pause there. We're 45 minutes in. I do have a bunch of stuff I want to share with you about wellness and the upside of it. And the short answer is, it turns out when we look at over 220 articles over 12 years, the overall effect size of social media and its correlation with well-being, and lots of different kinds of well-being, is effectively zero. And by effectively, I mean, we have a really precise estimate of zero. The confidence intervals are negative 0.04 to 0.02. So I think a lot of the hysteria around social media and its effect on well-being before the pandemic was overdone. And one thing the pandemic has done is led people to be thinking more about, like, what you're doing with these technologies is important, rather than how much time you're spending on them. So I'll just leave it there, and perhaps I'll come back again some other time and we can go into those well-being data with a little more depth. But thank you all for your attention, and happy to take questions.
Super. We have a stack of them that are piled up, and I think there's a nice sort of like digging in on a theme that I really like. My first question, I'm going to take complete advantage of being the person who's on Zoom who's doing this. And one of the things that was interesting was looking at those results, like Grinberg et al., like the follow-up paper. Is the implication that we're going to see the impact of fake news age out of the population? I mean, the analogy that's sort of in the back of my head is attitudes to homosexuality, right? Where if you look at sort of the people who are against gay marriage and you look at that as a statistical property of the population, and you look at the US, Western democracies, things like that, you're generally seeing that's a thing that's been a generational change, right? Are we going to see the impact of fake news age out of the population?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The short answer is yes.
Yay!
Yeah. We have a very strong presentism bias as humans. It's very difficult for us to imagine what things were like in the past, and we have a really hard time speculating, imagining the future. We tend to think that the way it is now is the way it always will be. And so fake news feels like this massive problem that we'll never be able to deal with. Now, it's not to minimize the risks and the problems, but yes, over time, we as humans adapt, and we gain experience over time. So those people that don't have experience will end up passing away. Those that are in their 60s and 70s are about to get a whole bunch of help There are a number of organizations that are now trying to work with adult children and directly with seniors on improving their abilities, and we're already starting to see improvement. So yeah, I'm quite optimistic. This is not the first time society's had to deal with fake news, um, and it won't be the last. But I think that this way in which fake news has been operating, and I'm thinking of the Russian playbook, um, we will become savvy to and be able to, through education and this sort of generational change, deal with.
That's a delightfully optimistic note. I'm kind of glad to hear that. Um, One of the questions is from Jennifer Davidson, who I think of as being in Portland, but maybe she's not. Now I'm like have that sudden moment of, wait, this is my own fake news. Um, there are three ingredients that you mentioned, which I want to make sure I've got all three. It's believability, reliability, and there's a third.
Competence.
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 Okay.
Right. So
Does that extend to organizations, or is that
yes.
just for interpersonal?
Yes. And so for people that are interested in learning more about this, I'd recommend Rachel Botsman's book. Botsman is Botsman. Who Can We Trust? And she does a really nice job of summarizing in academic literature. Typically, it's really complicated what signals something in academia, and we can never agree. But in this case, there are these three signals: competence, honest or trustworthy, appearing honest, trustworthy, warm, and reliability. The challenge, of course, is, as your one of your people before said, it's highly contextual. So I hope that I am, trustworthy and appear competent and reliable when talking about this research, but you wouldn't want me to be your dentist or to sing you a song. Both things I'd be terrible at. So I think that's a key thing, that as a lot of companies transition into this new era, they need to learn how to signal competence and honesty and reliability.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a problem that we run into in that a lot of questions about trust end up being uni-axis, right? Do you trust Amazon? And the problem is you get crossover between, do I trust Amazon to deliver my USB cable when they say they will? And do I trust them not to listen to me through the Alexa device when I don't want them to? And the sense I get is that humans are not very good about disambiguating these sort of roles of trust, in that if I trust Jeff and Jeff says, hey, looks like your bicuspid there needs a bit of work, and I'm like, well, I guess I trust him to do dental work as well. Is that the case?
Yeah, so there's a number of different kind of models about trust, and you're right. So one is this unidimensional model. It's the simplest one. I either trust or distrust you some level. Another one is a bidimensional model. So I can trust an entity like Amazon high on some dimensions, and I can distrust them on others. And those are independent. So exactly like you said, I trust them to deliver that on this time. I maybe distrust them about like the operation of or operations on my tax base in my county, or on whether they're going to listen to me. So we tend to have a multidimensional take on individuals. And then there's this third model, which is relational, and you see the sort of heavy reliance on kind of cognitive trust. So I'm assessing them, and does this seem right? And can I trust what they say? And then there's behavioral. Did they do what they said they were going to do? And then there's this last one that kicks in over time, which is relational. That is, I don't have to think or observe Joe Fish's behavior anymore. I've known him for a long time. We have established relational trust. And this happens with brands as well. And we all have that feeling of like, okay, I don't have to worry about it. It's this brand that I've been using for a long time. Violations occur. They can transform, in the same way that a violation in a marriage transforms that marriage. It can transform relationships with brands as well. It doesn't mean that it's over. I think people tend to overestimate how damaging violations are. They obviously are really harmful, but they change the nature of the relationship rather than necessarily ending it. And so that's another important thing to think about.
So this is a question which is a lovely follow-up to that from Alice Ree, who is in South Carolina. Do you have examples of other companies, particularly tech companies, who are doing particularly well around signaling trust? And why do you think they're doing such a good job?
Yeah, I'll think two, one American and one European. And there's a third, Alibaba. It goes back to that embedded trust. So taking all of the advantages of network trust and then embedding that inside what I'll call legacy trust systems, like contract law, like policing, like banking and payments, like insurance. And I think what they do is they use their brand to say, you're going to have this interaction with another person, and you're going to really operate that, you and these other people. So you have this sort of network form of trust. But we got you. So if anything goes wrong in there, we're going to, this brand, it's either Airbnb, BlaBlaCar in Europe, or Alibaba, they're using their brand to say, we're going to bring to bear these legacy forms of trust. So in a way, when I get in a car to do a long distance ride from Paris to Nice in BlaBlaCar, I don't have to worry about is how do I pay this guy? What if this guy turns out to be really like, he speeds a lot or acts criminally? I've got BlaBlaCar, the brand, to trust because they're bringing all these other forms of institutional trust to bear. I think that's what a lot of these companies that are successful are doing well. When you have things like Facebook, which has struggled with trust, it's because they're managing interpersonal relationships as well. And when people act poorly, they're doing it on the Facebook platform, and then Facebook takes in that, absorbs some of the blame for the way those people behave. Where I think these other ones that are engaging in sort of transactional things between people can draw more clearly on these institutional forms of trust.
One question that we have, and this is from Emma Humphreys, who is works out of the Mountain View office when she works out of the office, but of course that's not now. And I believe maybe in Campbell, or Fremont. I actually don't. Anyway, local. And she asks, I'm curious about communities who are used to deception by groups with power over them. Is there an opposite to the veracity effect? And I like that when I was thinking about the work that Susan Silby did, looking at how people think about the commonplace of law, I think is the title of the book, in which she talked about people who'd been disenfranchised and how their approach to understanding law was very, very different to people who were sort of in a mainstream majority kind of assumption. So
Right.
do you see differences in those populations?
Yeah, so I think we can think about this in two very different ways. One is the sort of corruption approach, Brazil being a really important example where corruption has run rampant in Brazil for decades, and it's really undermined people's trust in government, in the economy, in all the infrastructure that's there. And they're working really hard on rooting it out, but it comes at this massive cost because people will not listen to the government. They won't take direction from them. They end up engaging in behaviors that have to prioritize themselves and their families over larger goods. And so, right, they have to protect themselves from corrupt and powerful institutions. So that's one sort of like massive blinking warning sign about corruption. I think one reason that even when everything's going all to pot, that the U.S. is, people purchase U.S. dollars is that there's low corruption in the U.S. Another way to tackle that is thinking about totalitarianism. And here I think another book I'd recommend is Hannah Arendt's book, Lying in Politics. She's German and thinking about totalitarianism in the 40s and 50s. What she observes is something even more worrisome in some ways for a trust and deception person like me. She finds that totalitarian leaders will lie to their population. And the problem is that their supporters will then be okay with being lied to because they see it as their leaders using it as a weapon, a tactic to fight the enemy. And the enemy is whatever other political party there is in the country. So, I don't want to make this political at all, but when you have leaders that are willing to lie frequently, and then a part of a population that's willing to forgive those lies because they're viewed as part of a war, then you have a really hard time holding the leaders accountable. And I think Hannah's Hannah Arendt's analysis of this is the most cogent and the most sort of upsetting and disturbing, and why I think we have to hold leaders accountable when they engage in line, and we can't like let that go, I don't think. And that's a huge challenge for us.
That's a huge challenge, yes. And yes. I have one more that I'm going to squeeze in. I think we're over time, but it's such an interesting thread of questions that I want to continue, and it's all virtual anyway. And that question is from Miriam Avery, and she's in San Jose as well. How does skepticism, that overestimation of falsehood, interact with well-being? And I think that goes to the sort of the mystery portion of your talk that we didn't have a chance to get to.
Yeah. Oh, I love that question, and I have a good analogy. I have a really dear friend, Janine Zachariah, who's a world-class journalist, amazing. She teaches here at Stanford, and she is just constantly skeptical of everything, and as a result, quite worried about everything. And she and I debate a lot because, as an optimist, I don't. And I think what happens is most of us are not that skeptical. We have the truth bias in place, and most of the time it works great. And what I do with respect to Janine as an example is I'm a free rider. So I free ride on Janine's skepticism, and she pays a heavy price, which is being worried and anxious, because she's not going to trust that you are going to do what you say you're going to. She's going to like investigate that using, the best practices and tools of journalism. And so I think for most people, we have a good truth bias. We're reasonably suspicious when we should be. You're in that dark alley and a guy tries to sell you a Rolex, you're going to be suspicious. But there's other people, a smaller percentage of people amongst us, that are much more skeptical and help. They save us by ferreting out the lies and the scams and cheating when they do happen, and they pay a price. They are typically more anxious and worried than the people that have a strong truth bias. So that's how I see it operating. Most people can turn on that suspicion when it's needed, and then turn it off when they're interacting, with family and friends. But some amongst us, they pay that price. And if the truth bias is reduced overall, as I'm a little bit worried is happening right now, then more of us will be feeling the anxiety that comes with that.
There is a series of threads of people questioning the degree to which this particularly impacts news, right? And the degree to which this is the tension between sort of objective fact and spin.
Yeah.
And I think I definitely see this when I look at the studies of particularly mis and disinformation, and this question of whether there are biases there. I'm always a little suspicious because I'm not sure I believe in that objective truth, and yet you have that tension around that. I think we're going to close this up now, because we did reach the hour and we went over because it was getting really interesting. But Jeff, on behalf of Mozilla and the people watching around the world, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it. It's been superb.
Thank you, Joe Fish. Appreciate everybody's attention and all the great questions. Thank you.
Have a good day. Thanks very much. Bye-bye, everybody.